The United Nations emergency session descended into chaos as screens displayed the hegemony delegation's medical readings. President Okafor struggled to maintain order among panicking world leaders. "Everyone, please." Her voice cut through the clamor. "Dr. Chen has a preliminary report." Eliza Chen approached the podium, her lab coat still stained with the ambassador's iridescent blue blood. The xenobiologist's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her glasses. "What we're witnessing is unprecedented," she began. "Ambassador Jurek and his delegation aren't experiencing seizures. They're experiencing pleasure. Intense, overwhelming pleasure triggered specifically by human laughter." Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Their neurological scans show activation patterns similar to what we'd see in humans exposed to euphoric drugs, but magnified tenfold. The sound frequencies in our laughter are stimulating reward centers in their brains that have apparently never been activated before. General Williams of the Global Defense Force stood. "Are you suggesting our laughter is drugging them?" "Essentially, yes," Chen replied. "And based on the hegemony medical staff's reaction, this is completely unknown to them. Their physicians are treating it as a neurotoxin exposure." On the main screen, hegemony medics in sealed suits were loading the still-twitching ambassador onto their shuttle. The reptilian's normally stern face was frozen in an unnatural rictus, something between a grimace and a smile. "Doctor," President Okafor's voice was measured. "What are the diplomatic implications?" Chen's colleague, Dr. Patel, stepped forward with a data tablet. "We've reviewed their initial transmissions. The hegemony spans 10,000 worlds and 436 sapient species. Their cultural database makes no reference to humor, comedy, or laughter in any form. Not a single entry." A horrified silence fell over the room. "They're quarantining Earth," Chen added. "Their emergency protocols classify us as a Class A biological hazard. We've effectively been designated as a planet of drug dealers who weaponize sound." The Brazilian ambassador snorted, then covered his mouth in horror as others shot him warning glances. Outside the UN building, crowds had gathered despite security cordons. The hegemony arrival was supposed to be humanity's grand entrance to the galactic community. Economic opportunities, technological exchange, cultural sharing. Instead, the alien shuttle was hastily departing, trailing atmospheric burn as it accelerated toward their capital ship. In Times Square, the massive screens showing the diplomatic disaster suddenly cut to a news anchor trying desperately to maintain composure. In a shocking development, first contact with the galactic hegemony has been compromised by what officials are calling a cultural incompatibility. We go live to our science correspondent. The feed switched to a reporter outside the UN, just as someone in the background dropped a coffee. A small laugh from the crowd triggered a chain reaction. Within seconds, hundreds were laughing. A mix of nervous tension, absurdity, and the contagious nature of human humor working its magic. Aboard the departing shuttle, a junior hegemony medical officer removed her helmet too soon. The faint sound of distant human laughter filtered through the hull, and her pupils dilated instantly. Before her colleagues could intervene, she pressed her communication device. "We must study this further," she managed before being sedated. "The humans aren't attacking. They're sharing something beautiful." As the hegemony ship disappeared into the upper atmosphere, Dr. Chen stared at the sky from the UN rooftop. Her scientific curiosity was already overwhelming her apprehension. "We evolved laughter for social bonding," she whispered to herself. "What does it mean for an advanced galactic civilization to have never discovered it?" She didn't know it yet, but her question would soon launch her across the stars, and humanity's strangest trait would shake an empire to its foundations. Dr. Chen's ears popped as the hegemony shuttle adjusted its internal atmosphere. They'd allowed her aboard only after she'd signed 17 waivers and submitted to a neural dampening field that supposedly prevented her from weaponizing emotional resonance. "The field won't stop involuntary laughter," the technician had warned her, fitting the silver collar around her neck. "But it will reduce its potency." Now strapped into a quarantine pod designed for transporting hazardous specimens, Chen studied the crew through her transparent enclosure. The hegemony officers moved with perfect efficiency, their gestures precise and identical regardless of species. No smiles, no jokes, no casual banter. Just the quiet hum of a society engineered for optimal function. "Approaching Nexus Station," announced a melodic voice. "Prepare specimen for transfer." Chen bristled at being called a specimen but reminded herself why she was here. Humanity needed an advocate, someone to prove they weren't biological weapons in bipedal form. The view screen showed their destination. A massive ring structure orbiting a blue giant star, with thousands of ships docked along its circumference. "Home to the Galactic Xenological Research Institute," explained Kivex, the only officer who would speak directly to her. The lanky, pale alien had 6 fingers on each hand and pupils that expanded horizontally rather than radially. "Your species will be thoroughly documented before the High Council determines Earth's permanent status." "And how long will that take?" Chen asked. "Between 20 and 50 of your years," Kivex replied without inflection. Meanwhile, 12 million kilometers from Earth's quarantine boundary, Captain Marcus Rivera guided his ship, the Punchline, through the asteroid belt. The vessel, once a respectable Space Force corvette before Rivera's discharge, now sported mismatched hull plates and engines modified for stealth rather than regulation efficiency. "We're being scanned," reported Dawson, his navigation officer. "Hegemony patterns." Rivera nodded, watching the blinking dot of the quarantine buoy network. "Expected. Hold course." His crew, all former military personnel with similar black marks on their records, maintained practiced silence. They'd been briefed on the mission. Follow Dr. Chen's vessel, establish unofficial contact with potential hegemony sympathizers, and gather intelligence on the quarantine protocols. What Command hadn't told them, but Rivera had guessed, was that they were entirely expendable. The scanner beeped again. "Captain, I'm picking up a ship on the dark side of Ceres. It's just sitting there." Rivera frowned. "Hegemony? Signature matches of Phyrexian scout vessel. Hegemony auxiliary forces. They'd need special clearance to enter Sol system during quarantine," Rivera muttered. "Either they're enforcement, or they're here unofficially," finished his XO, Commander Lee. Rivera made a decision. "Take us in closer, passive scans only. If they're enforcement, they'd have challenged us already." As the Punchline drifted toward the asteroid, their communication array lit up with an incoming transmission. The signal was heavily encrypted but used an old Earth commercial protocol that no legitimate hegemony vessel would employ. The message was simple. "Humans, we seek trade. You have stories that make one feel. We have technology. Meet." Rivera glanced at his crew, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, seems we found our first customers." Lee raised an eyebrow. "You're not seriously considering meeting them?" "Command wanted intelligence on potential sympathizers," Rivera replied, already preparing a response signal. "I'd say an alien ship hiding from its own government to make contact qualifies." What Rivera didn't say was that he recognized an opportunity when he saw one. If humor was humanity's unique trait in a humorless galaxy, then perhaps it was also their most valuable commodity. "Tell engineering to prep our special cargo," he ordered. "The comedy recordings we weren't supposed to bring." In the darkness of space, 2 ships began a cautious approach. The first transaction in what would become the galaxy's most unlikely black market. The entrance to Cultural Research Facility No. 9 on Artaxis Prime was unremarkable. A plain door in a commercial district full of interstellar trading companies. Rivera adjusted his perception filter, a device that subtly altered how other species perceived human facial expressions. Without it, a single smile could blow their cover. "Remember," he whispered to Miko Zhang, "Earth's deadliest weapon in this strange new war. No laughing until we're inside, no matter what." Miko nodded. The former professional poker player turned comedian had a face that could remain perfectly expressionless while delivering lines that reduced humans to tears of laughter. It made her invaluable for these operations. The door scanned their retinas and slid open to reveal a long corridor lined with sound-dampening material. At the end, a Tsarian guard with crystalline skin examined them with compound eyes. "Password," the guard chittered. "George Carlin sends his regards," Rivera replied. The guard's crystals shifted color slightly, the Tsarian equivalent of anticipation, before ushering them through a series of security checkpoints. The final door opened to reveal what had become Rivera's most profitable enterprise, a comedy club 300 light-years from Earth. Inside, 24 aliens from at least 8 species sat in private booths separated by sonic isolation fields. Each booth featured neural regulators calibrated to their specific physiology, allowing them to experience human humor without the overwhelming effects of raw exposure. "Tonight's clients include 2 hegemony sub-ministers and a fleet commander," whispered Jax, Rivera's silverine business partner whose silver-scaled skin reflected the dim lighting. They paid triple for Maiko's live performance. Maiko took her position on the small stage as Rivera moved to the back room, where their real business happened. There, amid secured terminals and black market technology, Dr. Chen's research partner, Vex, was waiting. "The regulators are working," Vex reported, displaying neural scans on a holographic projection. "Subjects can now experience up to 68% humor stimulation without incapacitation." "Progress," Rivera acknowledged. "What about the archival data?" Vex's horizontal pupils contracted. "Concerning. I've decrypted additional historical records suggesting laughter once existed among at least 16 hegemony species. The neurological capacity remains, but something, or someone, systematically removed cultural expressions of humor." A warning light flashed on Rivera's wrist communicator. "Security breach," reported Dawson's voice. "Inquisitor ship just entered orbit." Rivera cursed. "How long?" "Minutes at most. Someone betrayed us." The captain made a split-second decision. "Initiate protocol punchline. Get our clients out through the tunnels, and make sure they understand this wasn't our doing." On stage, Maiko was just hitting her stride, a masterpiece of deadpan delivery that had aliens trembling with newly discovered laughter. Rivera caught her eye and gave the signal. Without missing a beat, she seamlessly transitioned to their emergency exit strategy, a joke so perfectly calibrated it would give them just enough time to escape. So these 3 hegemony officials walk into an Earth bar. As the punchline landed, creating just enough controlled chaos to cover their retreat, Rivera activated the data purge and slipped Vex a crystal data stick. "Get this to Chen," he whispered. "We've been compromised, but the network still holds on 6 other worlds. Rally Point Omega." Outside, black ships descended through Artaxis Prime's atmosphere, their hulls bearing the insignia of the Silence Inquisitors, the Emperor's personal enforcers who had never failed to capture their target. Until today, the Imperial Palace on Hegemony Prime dwarfed any human structure, a spiraling monument of crystalline alloys that captured and refracted starlight across the capital city. From their vantage point in a maintenance tunnel, Rivera studied the architectural plans Vex had stolen. "The central broadcasting hub is here," he indicated a spherical chamber near the palace core, heavily guarded but accessible through these service conduits during the millennial celebration. Beside him, Xandar, the former hegemony admiral whose massive frame made the tunnel seem even smaller, rumbled in his deep voice. "The celebration brings representatives from all worlds. Security will be diverted to the Grand Hall." "Which is why we'll be in the Grand Hall too," Maiko added, adjusting her ceremonial robes. The disguise transformed her into a perfect replica of a Taurian diplomatic aide. "I've memorized the protocols. I can get us through the first 3 security rings." Rivera nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. 3 days ago, they'd barely escaped the Inquisitors. Now they were attempting to infiltrate the most secure location in the galaxy with untested technology and a hastily assembled team. Dr. Chen's regulators are keyed to the main broadcast frequency, he reminded them, patting the devices secured in a shielded case. Once installed, they'll filter all outgoing transmissions from the palace, allowing controlled exposure to humor across the entire hegemony communications network. A revolution without a single shot fired, Xandar mused. My people have been slaves to emotional suppression for generations without knowing it. An alert pulsed on Rivera's communicator. It's time. Maiko leads. Remember, even the slightest inappropriate facial expression could trigger security protocols. Inside the Grand Hall, the millennial celebration overwhelmed the senses. 10,000 representatives from across the galaxy moved in perfect, choreographed patterns. The air itself seemed to shimmer with expensive molecular perfumes, designed to inspire appropriate reverence. Maiko glided through the crowd with practiced precision, her face a mask of subdued Taurian respect. Rivera and Xandar, disguised as her security detail, followed at the proper distance. The Emperor approaches, Xandar whispered. A hush fell over the gathering as the massive doors at the hall's center parted. The imperial procession emerged, 40 identical guards in ceremonial armor flanking a hovering platform. Upon it sat a figure that defied easy description. The Emperor's species had evolved beyond recognizable form, a being of shifting translucent tissues housing visible neural structures of incredible complexity. But what caught Rivera's attention were the shadows that seemed to cling to the Emperor's platform. Deeper than natural darkness, moving with purpose. Those aren't technological effects, he murmured to Xandar. What are those shadow things? The former admiral's composure slipped for the first time. The Imperial advisors. They're said to be manifestations of the universe's wisdom, guiding the Emperor's decisions. They're entities, Rivera realized with sudden clarity. Actual beings of some kind. As one shadow detached and drifted toward their position, Xandar stiffened. They sense irregularities in emotional patterns. If it touches you, it will know everything. Rivera watched the approaching darkness with growing dread. Their entire plan, Earth's future, the resistance movement, all would be exposed if that shadow reached them. Maiko, seeing their predicament, made a split-second decision that would change galactic history. She deliberately broke protocol, stepping into the shadow's path and executing a formal Taurian greeting, but with one subtle human addition. She winked. The shadow entity recoiled from Maiko's wink, as though struck by a physical blow. It writhed, tendrils of darkness twisting unnaturally before retreating toward the Emperor with unnatural speed. Move, Rivera hissed, guiding his team through the momentary confusion. That bought us minutes at most. They slipped through an unassuming service entrance, Xandar using his command codes to bypass the first security layer. The maintenance corridors were eerily empty, all personnel reassigned to the celebration. The archives are through here. Xandar indicated a sealed doorway emblazoned with the imperial crest, a spiral of stars converging to a single point. Rivera, the bypass sequence. As Rivera worked on the lock, Dr. Chen's voice came through their secure comm channel. Captain, I've analyzed the palace's neural suppression field. It's not just preventing laughter. It's actively dampening all emotional responses. The technology is far beyond anything in the hegemony's public research database. Almost like it's not their tech at all. Rivera muttered as the door finally yielded with a soft hiss. The Imperial archives stretched before them, a vast chamber of crystalline data storage matrices, glowing with the accumulated knowledge of 10,000 worlds. But what drew their attention was the central display, a historical timeline of the hegemony automatically activating as they entered. This is wrong, Xandar breathed, approaching the holographic display. The history I was taught began with the Emperor's lineage establishing order 3,000 years ago. This shows civilizations dating back 30,000 years. Maiko moved to a different console, accessing species development records. The display flickered, showing comparative neural scans of dozens of species. Each showed the same pattern: earlier evolutionary forms with neural pathways dedicated to emotional responses, later civilized forms with those pathways atrophied or surgically modified. "They did this to us," Xandar whispered, reaching out to touch the image of his own species. "They systematically removed our capacity for emotional expression, humor, joy, love, all to make us more efficient." A classified file marked "SOLEMNIT directive" appeared when Rivera input Dr. Chen's decryption codes. The contents made his blood run cold. "The parasites aren't advisory entities," he said, scanning the document. "They're called void feeders. They consume emotional energy, specifically the energy created by emotional suppression. The more emotions are suppressed, the stronger they become. An empire built to feed parasites," Maiko realized. Alarms suddenly blared throughout the facility. On the security monitors, they could see Imperial guards converging on the archives, led by shadow entities that seemed more substantial than before. "We've been discovered," Xandar warned. Rivera made a rapid decision. New plan. "Maiko, get to the broadcasting hub with these regulators. Xandar and I will download the archive data and create a diversion." "What kind of diversion?" Maiko asked, accepting the devices. Rivera pulled out a small case from his pocket. One last recording they'd saved for an emergency. The funniest routine in human history. No regulators, no dampening. Pure, unfiltered human comedy. "You'll be overwhelmed," Xandar warned. "Every guard within hearing range will be incapacitated." "That's the idea," Rivera replied grimly. "You get the data to Chen. Make sure the galaxy knows what's been done to them." As Maiko slipped away through a maintenance shaft, Rivera prepared to sacrifice everything for a revolution built on laughter. The Imperial Broadcasting Hub resembled the inside of a massive crystal geode, with control consoles arranged in concentric circles around a central transmission spire. Maiko moved silently between the workstations, her Taurian disguise blending perfectly with the handful of technicians monitoring the Millennial Celebration broadcast. The humor regulators weighed heavily in her hidden pocket. Each device, no larger than a thumbnail, represented thousands of hours of Dr. Chen's research, the culmination of understanding how humor affected alien neurophysiology and how to modulate its effects to prevent overwhelming sensory pleasure. A technician approached, and Maiko bowed her head in the proper Taurian gesture of deference. "You are not authorized for this section," the technician stated flatly. "Apologies," Maiko replied, adopting the characteristic Taurian speech pattern. "I bring an update for the Emperor's address." She presented a forged authorization code. As the technician scanned the code, Maiko heard Rivera's voice through her nearly invisible earpiece. "Diversion in 3, 2, 1. The palace shook with a distant boom, and emergency alerts flashed across every console. The technicians abandoned their stations, rushing toward the disturbance as security protocols dictated. Alone in the broadcast hub, Maiko moved quickly. She retrieved the regulators and began placing them at precise intervals around the transmission spire, following Dr. Chen's instructions. Each clicked into place, its microscopic tendrils extending into the crystalline structure. "Humor modulators active," she whispered into her communicator. "Ready for broadcast integration." Static answered her. Rivera's transmission had gone silent. In the archives, chaos reigned. Rivera had triggered his comedy bomb, a concentrated burst of Earth's finest humor broadcast through the facility's internal communication system. The effects were instantaneous and devastating. Guards collapsed mid-stride, overcome by neurological responses their brains had never experienced. Some writhed on the floor, eyes wide with unprecedented pleasure. Others stood frozen, facial muscles attempting expressions they had never formed before. But the shadow entities, the void feeders, were another matter entirely. The sudden burst of emotional energy seemed to cause them physical pain. They twisted and contracted, emitting high-pitched frequencies that shattered nearby crystal displays. "Now," Rivera shouted to Xandar, who was downloading the archive data. "Get to the emergency transmitter." The former admiral nodded grimly, clutching the data crystal containing evidence of the Empire's greatest crime against its citizens. As he raced for the exit, Rivera placed himself between the recovering Void Feeders and Xandar's escape route. "Hey, Shadow Boys," he called out, his finger hovering over the trigger for a second comedy burst. Knock, knock. In the Grand Hall, the Emperor's address was reaching its crescendo. 10,000 representatives stood in perfect attention as holographic displays showed the same scene replicated across every world in the hegemony. "For 3 millennia, our perfect union has maintained order across the galaxy," the Emperor's melodic voice resonated. "Today, we reaffirm our commitment to." The transmission flickered. Throughout the palace, across the capital planet, and throughout the galaxy, the Emperor's image was replaced by something unprecedented, a human face. Dr. Eliza Chen looked directly into the camera, her expression serious, but with a hint of something the hegemony citizens had never seen before, the slight upward curve of a smile. "People of the hegemony," she began, "you have been deceived." Dr. Chen's broadcast continued, her image now displayed on every screen across the hegemony. "For millennia, you have been robbed of something fundamental to conscious existence, your emotional heritage. What you are about to experience has been calibrated to safely reawaken neural pathways that were surgically suppressed in your ancestors." In the Grand Hall, Imperial guards moved to cut the transmission, but found themselves locked out of the systems. The humor regulators Maiko had installed were working, creating an impenetrable buffer around the broadcast signal. The Emperor rose from his hovering platform, his translucent form pulsing with agitation. "This is sedition. Terminate all communication networks immediately." But it was too late. Dr. Chen's face was replaced by a carefully constructed sequence of images, sounds, and concepts, the product of 6 months of research into species-specific humor triggers. The effect was not immediate, but it spread like ripples in still water. First, a Vrexian diplomat blinked her 4 eyes in rapid succession, a gesture unseen in her species for generations. Then a Taurian trade minister's mouth twitched at the corners. Within moments, sounds never before heard in the imperial palace began to emerge: chuckles, snickers, and finally, full-throated laughter. On Earth, the quarantine remained in effect, but something new was happening. The hegemony warships that had been maintaining the blockade were receiving the same broadcast as the rest of the galaxy. On their command decks, officers who had never questioned an order found themselves overcome with unprecedented sensations. Admiral Keth Zara of the Hegemony Enforcement Fleet watched in horror as his bridge crew doubled over, their disciplined composure shattered by uncontrollable laughter. "Maintain positions," he commanded, fighting his own unusual neural responses. "This is a human attack." His tactical officer, struggling to speak through fits of laughter, pointed to the long-range sensors. "Admiral, look." The display showed hundreds of void feeder entities emerging from hyperspace, converging on Earth with single-minded purpose. "They're coming to destroy the source," Keth Zara realized. Earth is their primary target. For the first time in his career, the Admiral faced uncertainty. The broadcast had awakened something long dormant in his mind, an understanding that the order he'd served his entire life was built on lies. He made a decision that would change the course of history. "All ships, new directive," he announced to the fleet. "Protect Earth at all costs." In the lower levels of the Imperial Palace, Rivera found himself cornered. The Void Feeders had recovered from his initial comedy attack and were converging from all directions, their shadowy forms more substantial now, twisted appendages reaching toward him with predatory intent. "You've fed on suppressed emotions for thousands of years," he said, backing against a wall. "Let's see how you handle the opposite." He activated his final weapon. Not another comedy recording, but something Dr. Chen had theorized might affect the parasites directly. Pure, unfiltered human joy. The device projected holographic images of human celebrations, laughter, love, and triumph, accompanied by matching emotional frequencies. The effect was instantaneous. The void feeders shrieked in a frequency that shattered every crystal surface in the chamber. Their shadowy forms began to dissolve at the edges, unable to maintain cohesion in the presence of such concentrated positive emotion. As consciousness began to fade, Rivera smiled at the irony. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't its laughter after all. It was joy itself. The grand amphitheater of New Terra buzzed with activity as delegates from over 300 formerly hegemony worlds gathered for the inaugural Galactic Confederation Council. 1 year after what historians now called the Laughter Revolution, the political landscape of the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. Dr. Chen adjusted her formal diplomatic attire, still uncomfortable with her new role as Earth's senior ambassador. Behind her, representatives from dozens of species mingled freely, their conversations punctuated by sounds that would have been scandalous just a year ago. Chuckles, guffaws, and the musical trilling that passed for laughter among the fractions. "Nervous?" asked Rivera, who had somehow survived his encounter with the void feeders. His recovery had taken months, but to date he stood tall, the only visible reminder of his ordeal being the silver streaks that now marked his once dark hair. "Terrified," Chen admitted. "We're about to propose humor integration therapy for the remaining isolated worlds. The Directorate representatives are skeptical it can work for the species most deeply affected by emotional suppression." Rivera's response was interrupted by the arrival of Tandar, now Premier of the Provisional Confederation Government. The former admiral's imposing frame was adorned with ceremonial regalia, but his face showed an expression that would have been impossible in the old regime, a broad, unreserved smile. "The council is ready," he announced, "and we have an unexpected guest." The amphitheater hushed as the central platform illuminated. There, supported by medical devices and attended by specialists, sat the former emperor. His translucent tissues had lost their luminosity, and his neural structures pulsed with a weaker rhythm, but his consciousness remained intact. "I have come," the emperor began, his voice no longer the confident resonance of a galactic ruler, but the hesitant tone of someone learning to speak anew, "to witness what I once sought to destroy." Chen stepped forward. "Your Eminence honors us with his presence." "No titles, please," the emperor replied. "I am simply Vexeller now, a patient in your remarkable therapy program." He paused, his neural tissues visibly reorganizing, a physical manifestation of new thought patterns forming. "Yesterday, I experienced something I had never known in 300 years of existence." I laughed. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the assembly. "The void feeders cultivated my lineage for generations," Vexeller continued. "They modify our neural structures to make us perfect vessels for their influence, incapable of emotional resistance. What your scientists have achieved, rebuilding these pathways, was thought impossible." Chen nodded toward Maiko, who had led the therapy team. "We discovered that humor is merely the beginning. Once those neural pathways begin to function, the full spectrum of emotions gradually returns." As the council session formally opened, screens displayed the current galactic situation. The void feeders had retreated to unknown regions of space after their defeat at Earth, but monitoring stations remained vigilant. Meanwhile, emotional archaeology teams worked throughout former hegemony space, recovering cultural expressions of joy and humor that had been systematically erased. Kahandar called for the first vote of the new confederation, the establishment of the Galactic Cultural Heritage Project, dedicated to preserving the rediscovered emotional expressions of all member species. As the unanimous approval was recorded, Rivera leaned toward Chen. "Not bad for a species that was quarantined as a biological hazard," he whispered. Chen allowed herself a smile. "Perhaps that's humanity's true gift to the galaxy, not just our laughter, but teaching others to find their own."